Hi, I'm Arthur Levine, and good afternoon to everyone. I really want to thank you for hanging in to the bitter end, the next to last session, day 37 of the ASU GSV Summit. Today, we're going to talk about the future of higher education. And we're doing this knowing full well that in 2015, no one got the correct answer to the question, what do you expect to be doing 5 years from now? So let's get going. This is the third in a series of talks at ASU GSV about the future of higher education, based on a study Scott Van Pelt and I have been conducting for the last 6 years, which will end up being a book from Johns Hopkins University Press next year. So look, if you want to understand the future of higher education, you got to look in three directions. You got to look backward, you got to look forward, and you got to look sideways. Only once before in American history have colleges and universities experienced change as rapid, as deep, and as continuous as they are today. And that was during the Industrial Revolution. Looking backward reveals the process by which that transformation occurred then, and that's being mirrored today. Looking forward projects the forces, demography, the rise of the knowledge economy, digital technology, globalization, a pandemic, with the capacity to shape higher education's future and their likely effect. Looking sideways, the study of knowledge organizations that were forced to change more quickly than higher education, and the lessons they may offer higher education about what's coming. 2 years ago, I reported on the findings of looking backward. Last year, I talked about the findings of looking forward. This year, I want to discuss what we learned by looking sideways. Okay, first, Cliff Notes, Wikipedia, of the previous findings. Looking backward found that the transformation of the Industrial Revolution really occurred in 7 stages. And this is where I apologize to you. It turns out my PowerPoint didn't make the presentation. However, I only had 3 PowerPoint slides, so it's not a big loss. Here are the 7 stages, the 8 stages. The first was broad social criticism of higher education. The public, the media were charging that it cost too much. This is the turn of the 19th century. That it was out of date with the times, and that it was anachronism. Sound familiar? That was greeted by denial by higher education. How could you possibly say that? What we're doing is exactly right. What followed were 3 decades of experimentation and innovation. Everything was up for grabs. How we taught, who the students were, what the curriculum was, how it was shaped, all of that. There was denial by the higher education community of the experimentation. Most failed. New models came into being. And there were 3 that were outstanding. One's with Johns Hopkins University, and that was really the first great research university, offering the first real graduate programs. The second was MIT, which offered technical instruction for the first time in a serious way. And the third was Cornell University, which was this big, comprehensive university where any person could study any subject. And then what happened, the next stage was those 3 models diffused throughout higher education and started being adopted by universities all across the country. But there was a huge problem. It was like Dodge City. Everybody did everything differently. They couldn't even agree on what a course was. So it was necessary to create some standards. And the first standard they created was, how about if we put together a unit, a way to measure what people are doing? And they created the Carnegie unit. And then what we needed was a sheriff to try to enforce all of this. And that was accreditation. The next stage was all those little pieces ended up being integrated and scaled up. And when that happened, we had the rise of today's industrial era higher ed system. Okay, looking forward. What looking forward found was that higher education was going to be able to meet the demographic, the economic, the early tech, internet and mobile devices, and globalization by adaptation. That doesn't mean institutions won't close. What that means is we're going to maintain the historic mission, the organization, and the practices. None of those things are going to disrupt higher education. Okay, now it's time to look sideways. And we're going to look at 3 different industries: music, film, and newspapers. Every one of them face the same challenges as higher education. Same demographic, economic, technological, globalization, and pandemic challenges as higher ed. These for-profits, though, were forced to respond much more quickly. And the reason is that for-profits change by a process of repair or reform of the existing organizations. We don't throw them out, we try to fix them. In contrast, for-profits change by replacement. When existing organizations are outdated or unprofitable, they just throw them out. The former is much slower. It tends to be involved, less out-of-the-box thinking, and it's much less comprehensive. It's all about piecemeal reform. Okay, the shocker to us, Scott and me, was, and maybe it's naive to, but the sagas of the 3 industries were fundamentally the same. It was like reading stories by the same B novelist. They all had the same plot. Let me tell you the plot. I'm going to tell you a story, and the story has a moral for higher education. Okay, all 3 industries are products of the Industrial Revolution. Newspapers have been around since the 17th century in the United States, but their modern form all happened during the Industrial Revolution. Underlying these 3 industries were brand new technologies: phonographs, motion picture cameras, projectors, steam, then electric printing presses. They created new forms of organization. They created film studios. They created music labels. They created newspaper companies. And they were all in the same business. Every one of those industries was producing and distributing bundled products: records, movies, newspapers. They established consumer bases. Movies and music were national and international. Newspapers were largely local and regional. They had 2 very different revenue models. In movies and films, the customer paid for everything. In newspapers, advertisers produced the lion's share of the revenue. The consumer only paid a fraction of the cost, and the volume of consumers drove the advertising revenue. It was so good that Rupert Murdoch described advertising revenues as rivers of gold. Those rivers have since dried up. For consumers, newspapers were the only subsidized product. Okay, so we got an industrial model for all 3 industries. We have an organization, we got technologies, we got a revenue model, we got a marketplace, we got content, we got production, and we got distribution. And you know something? That worked really well for much of the 20th century. But there were a few hiccups. One hiccup was new technologies, particularly television and radio. The first response by the 3 industries was to sue the hell out of them, tell them they couldn't infringe on their territory. They were each greeted by existential fear. But what finally happened was music and radio, film and television proved to be natural partners. For radio, or for music, radio was a way of advertising their product. For films, TV was a secondary market for showing their films. In contrast, newspapers, radio, and television were all competitors. They each gave away their product for free, and they each depended upon the size of the audience for their advertising revenue. So what it meant was news and all three media were competing one after the other. The second hiccup was regulatory agencies. The initial response by the three industries was, hey, buy the new technologies. Music labels bought radio stations. They created their own. Film studios purchased television stations. They created their own. And newspapers acquired both, which was pretty clever. But a combination of anti-monopoly rulings by the Federal Communications Commission and the Supreme Court drastically reduced cross-media ownership, driving down revenues dramatically, especially for newspapers. Then there was a change, then there was a third hiccup. And that third hiccup was changing consumer tastes. It turned out consumers thought it was a good thing to have sound in films way before studios. They liked home video players, and they wanted to listen to rock and roll. Well, what the studios did was wait. They didn't do anything. All three industries did nothing. They tried to quash the changes, and when they couldn't do that, they finally adopted them. They were so strong, however, that no new competitors drove them out of the business. So, okay. So we have then is music, movies, and newspapers are all able to adapt to changes that came their way. And the business models they created early in the 20th century remained intact well into the 21st century. By the way, I want to end this talk with about 15 minutes left so that you can all ask questions if you have them. Then came the digital revolution. And what it did was disrupt all three industries. We know the end result, at least as much as it's developed so far. What we found was that streaming services now dominate the film and music industries, but they not only engage in distribution, they're producing content. The newspaper industry, much of the advertising moved to better targeted, more effective, cheaper social media. The big winners initially were Google and Facebook. The number of sources of news content have exploded. So what's this all mean? Consumers have access to a multiplicity of content sources. They can access that content 24/7, any place, via mobile devices. The content they can access is unbundled. They can purchase a track rather than an album, or a story rather than a newspaper. The content is consumer rather than producer determined. Okay, the transformation of three industries is still underway. However, and the outcomes, I guess, are uncertain, but the future of each promises to be digital, and the industrial models are dying. So I don't think any of this will surprise anybody at ASU GSV. The question is, how did these industries that had weathered all kinds of changes, including technological changes, get disrupted? And I think there are a bunch of answers. The first is they didn't know what business they were in. They weren't in the record, film, or newspaper business. They were in the music, movie, and news business, which is fundamentally different. The three industries clung tenaciously to their industrial models and to their industrial products, albums, films, and newspapers. The end result is that even after the model broke, they were still holding on to their industrial products. And what they did was they behaved like not-for-profits. They tried to respond to the digital revolution by repair, by reform, by adaptation. They continued to do this even when their businesses were being disrupted and they were threatened with replacement. So why not? Was that such a big error? The strategy has always been successful. Why wouldn't it be successful now? It worked on demography, it worked on the economy, it worked on new technologies. Why wouldn't it work now? If it ain't broken, don't fix it. But it was broken. Technological change disrupted them. And what the three industries did was they flailed in the face of ongoing technological revolution. They threw a flurry of puny remedies against the wall, and nothing stuck. They tried things like teletext and video text. But the big mistake they made, they took the failures of these innovations to be consumer approval of current practice. And they just continued. They neglected the changing desires of consumers, the emergence of new competitors, and the advent of digital technology. Their vision was really claustrophobic. They focused on the short run rather than investing in the future. And they really expected tomorrow to be a mirror of today. They turned to organizations like Blockbuster, which is a fascinating innovation. But what it did was it maintained studio control and continued using analog formats. And by doing that, they added more revenue for a short period of time. But they also gave the disruptive competitors time to develop their product rather than joining that marketplace and those products. The re-envisioning of the three industries and the replacements, you know this, it came from outside. It came from organizations like Google, Facebook, BuzzFeed, Netflix, Spotify. An interesting question is, what would the future have been if any of the three industries had bought YouTube, Facebook, or Netflix? You know, Blockbuster was offered the opportunity to buy Netflix and turned it down. What would have happened if things had worked out differently? So what are the takeaways for higher education? What's the moral of the story? The first one is, know your competitors. New content producers and distributors are burgeoning. And they're entering the higher ed market as they did the other three industries. They're driving up institutional competition, consumer choice, and they're driving down prices. And we're at a time in which everything in higher education is in motion. And the new providers are playing with all of these pieces. They're playing with methods of delivery, with the content they deliver, with certification, with assessment, with the time and place in which higher education is offered, with the price that's charged for higher education, with the populations they're educating, and with a marketplace, a cornucopia of new providers. And all of them are seeking to offer post-secondary education or some facet thereof cheaper, faster, better, or more convenient. I want to talk about one of them, which has actually fascinated me, and that's Coursera. You all know Coursera, online learning platform company, a pioneer MOOC, launched in 2012. In 2019, it was valued at something north of $1 billion. Today, it offers 47 million users, more than 4,000 courses, cutting across the liberal arts and technical subjects. Now, the amazing thing to me is who's offering content on Coursera. It's this eye-popping list of 200, more than 200, of the world's leading universities and businesses. Its higher education partners are a veritable who's who of colleges and universities. They're places like Caltech, Columbia, Duke, Hebrew University, Johns Hopkins. Moscow State University, Beijing University, Princeton, University of Michigan, North Carolina, Yale, and that's just a few. Now that's real impressive. What I find even more impressive is that they're offering classes, specializations, and certificates from business and not-for-profits outside of higher education. And these are the leaders who are shaping the industries that they're in. They're in technology, and their partners are Cisco, Google, IBM, Intel, and Microsoft. All of them are offering instruction on Coursera. In finance and management, they're dealing with AXA, Goldman Sachs, Price Waterhouse. In merchandise and sales, they're dealing with Alibaba, Amazon, Danone, L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble. And those are not-for-profits. Those are the for-profits. The not-for-profits include the Museum of Natural History, the Museum of Modern Art, National Geographic, and the World Bank. The list goes on and on. Now, that's interesting, but you need to look behind and see what they're offering. Let me tell you about two programs. The first is Google's Information Technology Certificate Program. Now, that was created to fill a labor force need. It consists of 5 competency-based courses. Students give ratings of 4.7 on a 5 scale or higher for each of those courses. It's a sub-baccalaureate program, a field commonly offered at 2- and 4-year colleges. It's worth 12 college credits, and they're awarding a Google badge, which is accepted employment credential, and it's lined with professional licensure tests and standards. More than 147,000 students have enrolled in the program, which Google says you can complete in 6 months or less, studying 5 hours a week at a cost of $49 a month. The first month is free, and students only commit a month at a time. Let's talk about the second course. That one's offered by the Museum of Modern Art. It's titled In the Studio, Post-War Abstract Painting. It's 27 hours in length. It's priced at $49 a month. It's earned a 4.9 rating out of 5 and currently enrolls 44,000 students. This course description reads like a modern arts course at just about any university. 55% of the alumni who've completed this liberal arts course say it had a tangible impact or benefit on their careers. So look, we got 2 courses. They couldn't be more different. One's vocational, the other one's straight up liberal arts. So what do they share in common? Besides being cheap, convenient, and highly rated with unreported completion rates, which I suspect are low. What they share in common is that they're being offered by non-higher education providers. The number and range of what's being offered is staggering. If you go and look at the companies that are offering programs through Coursera or courses, those courses are just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond what Google is offering in Coursera, it has 78 more certificate programs of its own, and Microsoft has 77. On the not-for-profit side, the American Museum of Natural History has its own grad school. It offers a PhD and a Master of Arts in Teaching. It offers courses for PD, professional development, at $549 each for teachers. The biggest producer right now of professional development for science teachers, and the biggest distributor, is PBS. So where we are is here. In terms of Coursera, the looming issue for higher education isn't the explosion of content by Coursera and all the others, but the world-class standing of Coursera's providers. non-elite universities may be at a real disadvantage in competing with industry giants. Students have the option of studying at and obtaining certification through Google, an international powerhouse with the latest technology and the top human capital, or they can attend the more expensive local regional university. And there are all kinds of reasons they might do that. They have the choice of studying at the American Museum of Natural History or MoMA, or they can attend the local college. And there are all kinds of reasons they might do that. These courses are available 24/7. They start anytime a student wants to study. They can do it any place. They're a mashup of courses and competencies. And these organizations really move quickly. They are agile. When colleges were putting their courses online and closing their campuses, Coursera began offering courses on coronavirus and COVID-19. It also announced a coronavirus response initiative, giving pandemic-impacted colleges and their students access to Coursera courses for free. Within a month, 2,600 programs had been utilized by institutions across the country and around the world. So, you know what? Most of the new providers won't have the stature of Coursera or its partners. Nearly all are going to enroll fewer students. But it's not clear what choices students are going to make between traditional and non-traditional providers. What is crystal clear is that traditional higher education is facing mounting competition from what amounts to an army, a mushrooming number of new content providers. And those content providers, maybe the local publisher, the software maker, the library, the museum, the television station, the new entrepreneurial initiative, all of those things are going to be competing. Students are going to have dramatically more choices, often at lower cost, in how, when, and where they learn. A second takeaway, know your consumers. When we speak of higher education today, what we do is we think about colleges and universities. And why wouldn't we? Everything else about higher education is ephemeral. Knowledge evolves, faculty, students, and programs change, colleges are constant. The same thing's true in industry, for-profit and not-for-profit, in terms of the institutions that comprise them. There are courts, there are hospitals, there are banks, there are schools. Organizations became the centerpiece of economic life and thinking during the Industrial Revolution. Looking sideways is an account of three industries which during the Industrial Revolution and after were dominated by a single institution: music labels, film studios, and newspapers. The specific label or film studio changed over time. So did the regulations. So did the technologies. What remained was what continued. What was constant was the fact that the institutions were the key actor. They defined the industry in terms of the business model and the way we thought about it. Motown, Disney, the New York Times. Here's the point. In the music industry, or in the music, film, and newspaper industry, the producers and production of content were organizations and institutions. They were the centerpiece. In contrast, the knowledge age focuses on the users of that content, consumers and consumption of content. The consumer became the dominant force in the industry, and institutional control declined. That may well happen in higher education as well. With near universal access to digital devices and the internet, students or consumers have the capacity to ask for higher education, exactly the same things they've gotten from the music, movie, and newspaper industries. They can ask for instruction 24/7. They can ask that it be available anyplace through mobile devices. They can ask that it be consumer determined or curated. They can ask that it be individualized or personalized. They can ask that it be unbundled. And they can ask that it be low cost. Another takeaway is that colleges and universities need to create the future rather than attempting to restore the past. When campuses closed in spring 2020, Scott and I spoke with college presidents, the heads of the higher education associations, policymakers, and accreditors about COVID-19 and the post-pandemic plans. Now, most of them viewed the pandemic in the same fashion. They viewed it sort of as they view any natural disaster, a flood, a tornado, a hurricane. They wanted to get back to business as soon as possible, clean up the damage, and restore what had been lost. That makes all kinds of sense. But it's really a misunderstanding of the nature of the pandemic. It was viewed as an interruption in doing business as usual, rather than an accelerator of the changes to come. The people we spoke to, for the most part, expected to turn back the clock to 2019, prior to the pandemic, and recreate the pre-COVID colleges. They wanted to recapture the past, and that's not any more possible today than it would have been to resurrect the jobs requiring a high school diploma or less that were lost during the Great Recession. What the recession did was reveal a world that was being made. It was still inchoate. But what it said was the jobs, the labor markets, the educational requirements for employment were being recast. That's true of the changes that have been caused by COVID as well. And what it really does is show the direction that colleges and universities can be expected to move in the years ahead. We paid a really high price for that knowledge. But what it provides is an opportunity for institutions as they plan to reopen their physical campuses, to ask not simply how they restore what existed prior to COVID, but how they ask what they want and need to become in a global digital knowledge economy. It's a chance to look forward, but it requires institutions to overcome a series of hurdles. One is magical thinking. It's the belief that the challenges they're facing are somehow going to vanish or fail to materialize. The second is complacency and an assumption of institutional exceptionalism, which holds every college as special, ultimately shielding it from the woes that confront other institutions. The third is they've got to stop short-term thinking and move toward long-term vision and planning. There are a gazillion 5-year plans in American colleges, but there's a tendency for most colleges to just think a year ahead. And what that does is discourage creative thinking and investing in the future. Fourth is exactly the mistake that the three industries made: the tendency to view failed attempts at innovation. You know, the first time we tried online learning, it was a failure, to be an affirmation of current practices. And finally, there's campus politics. It's divides between administrators, faculty, trustees. Now, Every institution's future depends upon overcoming these barriers. It's a job of presidents and boards to lead their institutions into the future and to educate their communities about the challenges and opportunities ahead. And what the pandemic provides is the perfect moment to do it. So here's what we know. What we know is one other point. Higher education, like those other industries, didn't recognize what business it's in. There's a tendency for higher education to think that it's in the campus, degree, and credit business, when in fact, it's in the education business. With those other industries, and with the world we live in today, knowing what business we're in takes on a special urgency, as every existing institution is negotiating a shifting terrain in which new competitors, new products, new methods of distribution, and new consumers are emerging. That's what higher education is facing. And asking what business they're in. Higher education can't equate it with the activities in which they're currently engaged. It's essential to recognize that traditional methods of distribution may be liabilities. Traditional products may be outdated. Consumer tastes may be changing. An interesting question for me. One of the big industries that's taken off has been online program management. And it is entirely unfair. Excuse me. But one of the questions that we need to ask is, will this ultimately retard higher education movement to a new global digital knowledge economy, a la Blockbuster, opening up a new distribution channel for an outdated product? Will OPMs, like Netflix, become higher education's competitors, producing their own content? I have no clue, and it was probably unfair to even ask those questions. Okay, I'm going to throw in a fifth question, or a fifth takeaway. And it's this. Remember, COVID didn't shift the direction of higher education changed. It merely accelerated it, including institutional closures, the proliferation of new providers, online learning, just-in-time, non-degree education for upskilling and reskilling, micro-credentials. The bottom line is the time is short. This is the moment for higher education to act. Thank you. Well, I haven't left much time. Are there any questions? Well, that's pretty good. I think this question must have come from the publisher. Can higher education wait until 2021 for your book to be published? The answer is higher education needs to act now. It needs to act today. It needs to ask difficult questions. In the changing landscape, it sounds like it's going to get more difficult for students, their families, and adult learners to navigate the higher ed market. If you agree, how long do you think it'll take for the options to become easier to navigate? I think for the next little while, what we're really talking about is a morass. All these things are being invented. Do you remember when we started? I said that higher education's transformation during the Industrial Revolution went through 7 or 8 stages. Where we are right now is experimentation. All these new things are experiments. Models will emerge. And you can see some of them beginning. Historians will tell us what the models were. But things like Western Governors and Southern New Hampshire University certainly seem like they could be models. How do you square the theory with the idea that actual business of higher education is sorting more than learning? I guess I don't believe that. And if it really is more in the business of sorting than learning, then it's failing. The reality is, for me, I apologize, for me and many other people who went through higher education, it made our lives. Higher education in the past and in the future is going to be the future of higher education, of anybody who goes through it. And there's no future for anybody who doesn't go through post-secondary education. So what we need to do is for higher education to be terribly effective. Sorting isn't enough. And I guess what I'd also argue is that most of higher education in America isn't highly selective, and that they don't sort. What they're really in the business of educating, and they have to do it as well as they can and better than they've ever done it. Wondering what specific actions you would recommend higher education take right now. What's your call for action? The call for action is exactly what I suggested. Campuses all closed in the spring. They're all either still online or they've reopened. This is a wonderful time for communities to sit down, college by college, and ask where we want to go. We can't go to where we've been. They need to study who the competition is. They need to study who their students are. We all know this. If you look at those students who are full-time, 18 to 22, and living in residence, that's less than 25% of all college students. The future lies in the hands of the other 75%. And if I had to guess, the new majority is going to be those people who are driven by the employment market and driven by automation and driven by the short life of knowledge will be coming back to higher education throughout their lives for additional instruction, non-degree. And the question is, does higher education want those students? If they don't, the post-secondary sector will take them. Do you have some hat you covered in the blog for accessible online addition to this recorder? I'm not quite sure what that means. Some of that you covered in the blog or accessible online. What I'd suggest is the best I can do is send you the PowerPoint that I didn't project, which makes all the major points that I made. How do I define education itself? All of it.